Thank you for joining us this evening for Advanced Assessment Creation in Schoolnet. And at the bottom left of your screen, you should see the bit.ly that will allow you to access the slide deck that we'll be using this evening. And the slide deck will remain available for your use in the future, so feel free to write that down in your notes and save it for later. If we haven't met yet, I'm John Mars, your Schoolnet product manager and home-based trainer for the Digital Teaching and Learning Division here at NCDPI. So this evening we will go over creating some technology-enhanced items, and I'm really just going to focus on one particular technology-enhanced item. We covered the others back in our October webinar, and we will share some links to that recording with you if you're interested in learning more about those. We'll also look at creating passages, tasks, and rubrics, so sort of the other things that are more than just test questions. And then we'll wrap up with a few extra resources and time for Q&A if there are any at that point. And that brings us on to the Access for Schoolnet training. So if you would like to log into the training site and follow along with me this evening, you are more than welcome to do that. You are also welcome to just follow along with me on screen this evening. So first up is creating tech-enhanced items, and there are a number of different technology-enhanced items that are available in Schoolnet. We went over a number of them back in our October 2020 Schoolnet webinar. And if you look in the speaker notes of this slide deck, on this slide, there is a link to the recording and the slide deck from October. So you can definitely check that out if you would like a refresher on how the other tech-enhanced items work. So to get started, I'm on the homepage of our Schoolnet training site, and we're actually going to spend all of our time this evening under the Assessments drop-down over on the left. And we're going to be using the second Create link under the Items, Rubrics, and Passages heading. And once you click that, it will pop open the menu of all the different types of things you can create in Schoolnet. And we're looking specifically at the online-only question type. So these are the technology-enhanced items that are only available in an online test. They can't be printed out. So back in October, we did go over the hotspot. So that is students selecting a region or area on an image as their answer, and it can be a single area or multiple areas. Also in October, we talked about drag and drop and the click, stick, click, drop. So that's more or less dragging answer choices out of a word bank into some categories or something like that. So this evening, we'll look at the gap match question type. So I'll go ahead and click on gap match to get started. And as always, the first three things when you're creating an item in Schoolnet will be to select your subject, your grade range, and finally your standards alignment. So for this one, I actually found an IT example I'm going to use. So we'll set this to IT for high school. And then we'll select our standards alignment. Drill down to that particular standard. And once you've got the basic info there filled in, we can get into creating our actual question. So it's going to remind us what the question type is. If we wanted to change that, we could change it at this point right here. This is also over here on the right where you could link a passage, and we'll look at creating passages here in just a little bit. But keep in mind, you can link a passage at this point as well. So for a gap match question, the first box we come to is going to be our actual question content. And when you click in, you'll get this rich text editing bar so that you can format your question or add images or equations, all that fun sort of stuff. You also get this insert new gap option. So you'll use this button to insert the blank or blanks where students are going to drag an answer choice. So this question, or in this case statement, actually starts with a blank. So I'll hit insert new gap to start out with a blank and start typing my question. And this particular question is going to have two gaps, so I'm going to hit insert new gap again to insert a second gap and continue on with my statement. So now that we've got our question written out, we can create our answer choices. So I'm going to go ahead and plug in some answer choices here. And I'm actually going to add two more answer choices here. And I'll also point out over here on the right, you can choose to turn on answer choice categories. So the way this is set up now, all of these answer choices will just sort of appear together in a word bank. You could categorize them if you so chose, in which case you would just check the little box to turn that on. Enter your category names, whatever they may be, and then you would select a category for each answer choice. In this case, the question is kind of asking a student to categorize these, so I'm going to leave that turned off, but know that that is an option. So once you've got your question written and your answer choices all plugged in and set up the way you like, we'll continue on down to match gaps with answer choices. So this is where we actually identify the answers that are correct. And you can customize your scoring model, so should students receive points for each correct answer, or should it be all or none? Students have to get both gaps correct or all gaps correct in order to receive points for this question. I'm going to leave mine on default for now. Below that, you will have a tab for each gap that you've added to the question. In this case, we have two gaps, so I've got two tabs. If you had added 3 gaps or more, you would see a tab for each gap that was added in the question. So for gap 1, we're going to identify the answer or answers that are correct. Now, I should point out that with a gap match question, students are only going to be able to input one answer per blank. So although there are 3 correct answers for this first gap, students will only be selecting one of these. And then we'll select our correct answer or answers for the second gap. And we've even got a distractor thrown in there. And as usual, you can, for each answer choice, add an explanation for either the teacher or the student to see if they select that answer choice. And down toward the bottom, this should look familiar, but it will review your standards alignment and allow you to add any tools and manipulatives, formula reference sheet, teacher instructions, or additional properties if you'd like to fill those in, such as the Bloom's level. If you're happy with all that, you can either save it straight to a bank or you can preview it first. I'm going to go ahead and preview it just so you guys can get a taste of what this looks like. And it's going to pull this up in TestNav. So this is what a student would see. And so they'll be able to drag an answer to each blank. And we can even calculate the score to make sure that that's working right. So that is a gap match item. If you're happy with the preview and everything looks good, you can go ahead and save it to your personal bank. Or you can save it to another bank if you've been creating additional item banks, or even if you want to create additional item banks at that time, you can do that from there. And item banks are something that we went over back in that October webinar I mentioned as well, but more or less think of them as folders where you can store items in Schoolnet. So now we've got our gap match question saved, and it is ready to be pulled into an assessment. So before I go on, do we have any questions on the gap match item type or on any of the other technology enhanced items while we're talking about it? It looks like we're pretty quiet out there, so I will take that as a good sign. And we'll go ahead and shift gears a little bit and talk about creating passages. So if you do have a passage that isn't already in Schoolnet, you can add it pretty easily. And this might be nice if you've got, a passage that maybe even you wrote a passage, or you've got one that you have the rights to use and you want to throw it into Schoolnet with some questions. I will mention you'll want to be careful of copyright when you're adding passages to Schoolnet, especially if it's a passage you're going to share with other teachers in your school or district. You'll definitely want to be sure that you have the right usage rights to use that passage before it's added to the system. But with that said, let's go ahead and dive into creating a passage. So we will expand the assessments section here on the left again and go to the second create link under items, rubrics, and passages. And this time we're going to create a passage. And once you get here, you'll start with sort of the basic information for the passage. So we'll pop in a title, a subject, and a grade level. And you can also choose to show additional optional properties here. So if you, for example, have, this is a public domain passage that I'm using, so I'll put in the actual author's name. And maybe if you've got the Lexile level for the particular passage, you could put that in. You could also put in the year of publication. This is a good time to mention a little gotcha that I noticed when I was creating this presentation. Schoolnet does not like a year prior to 1900. So this particular passage was written in 1892. So in this case, I'm just going to leave the year blank so that I don't have to worry about it not liking years before 1900. Just kind of a weird little quirk that we happened across. Once you've entered all of the basic information about the passage, you get into the passage content. And so just like when we were creating a question, you have the rich content editor bars here where you can add images, media, equations, format your text, all sorts of fun stuff. I'm just going to dump the content of this passage in here. All right, we've got that pasted in, and we could format the text a little bit if we wanted to. And someone asked in an earlier session, you could even add an image in here if you wanted to add a new line and use the little mountains and sun icon to insert an image. You could do that. This image is a little bit giant, so probably not a good one to use, but it proves the point. There we go. So you can insert images into your passages and format them as you see fit. Once you're done with that, the last couple things on this page, you can customize the layout for this passage online. So by default, it'll be set to portrait mode, so the passage will display on the left with questions on the right. You can switch this to landscape mode, so it'll show the passage on top with the questions underneath. This passage is a bit long, so I'm going to leave it on the default of portrait, so they'll see the passage right next to the questions. There's also this thesaurus button here, which is pretty handy. So especially if you are maybe writing your own passages, you can highlight a word and hit that thesaurus button to look that up. And a thesaurus, maybe you're having a moment and you need a better word. That tool is there for you. I'll also point out that it gives you the word count down here, and it even lets you customize the word count. So maybe in this case, I included the passage title and author in the passage content, maybe I want to subtract those from my word count. And this is a good time to mention another little quirk that I noticed. This passage may honestly be a little bit too long to reasonably use in Schoolnet, because if you have a word count over 5,000, you're going to get an error when you try to save. Now, I found that you can trick it like this and get it to save anyway, but weird things may happen. I would definitely recommend keeping your passages under 5,000 words just to avoid any strange issues. And I see we did have a question come in from Janice about color coding highlighting. So yes, you could, if you had maybe a particular statement or something you wanted to highlight for your students, you could do that. And so now that line would be highlighted for any student who saw this passage. Great question. Thank you. So if I'm happy with this, I'm going to go ahead and save this to my bank. And it'll pop up and ask me if I want to save it in my personal bank, or if I had another bank I had access to, it would be listed here. I could also create a new bank. I'm just going to go ahead and toss it into my personal bank for now. And again, if you want to learn more about item banks, we did talk about that back in October. So once you save your passage, you'll be dropped into the passage detail screen. So over on the left, it'll give you a preview of the passage content. And you can see it's got our image, it's got our highlighted line here. And it'll show you all the additional properties on the right. So we've got our Lexile level that we plugged in here for this passage. If you scroll all the way down, you'll see it will list all the items linked to this passage. We don't have any right now. And we've also got the passage test history that'll list all tests that this passage has been used on. And if you wanted to add some items for this passage at this point, you can hit add new item right here and create some new items to go with this passage. Or if you remember, there was the option to link a passage when we went to assessments create too, right? So 2 ways to link a passage and an item together. I kind of like that you can just do it from here directly, but it leaves you with that flexibility. And I believe that is all there is to it with passages. So before I move on to our next section, do we have any other questions in regards to creating passages or using passages in Schoolnet? And I see we did have a request to go over a hotspot question type again. So I can definitely add that in here in just a little bit, by the way. So seems quiet, so we will go ahead and move on. Excuse me. So the next sort of thing for us to look at that I think is pretty interesting is a task. So typically when we're talking about Schoolnet assessments, it's single items, right? Oh, I'm sorry. We do have a request for clarification on linking a question to a passage. So there are 2 ways. We can either go into our item bank where we saved that passage. Where we saved that passage. We can view passage details. So, and this is that screen that it dropped us to when we first saved our passage, right? And way down at the bottom, you can add a new item to it. You could also just directly create a new item. So maybe if we wanted to create a multiple choice, and right over here you can add a passage right to the right when you're editing the question content, and you can link it to a passage right here. So hopefully that answers the question. Okay. So shifting back to tasks, So a task on a Schoolnet exam or assessment is a series of questions that are logically grouped together. So it's a multi-part question. And when you set up scoring on a task, you can do it one of two ways. So you can either have it set up as standard scoring, so students get points for every correct answer. Or you can set up what's called pattern scoring. So a student has to get part A correct to receive points for part B. So even if they get part B right, if part A is wrong, they won't get any points, which I think opens up just some interesting possibilities in Schoolnet. So let's go ahead and jump back into training, and we will create a task. I don't know why I closed this tab. Okay. So yet again, we will expand our assessment section, and we are on the second create link under items, rubrics, and passages. And this time we're going to create a task or a multi-part question. And so just like we saw a little while ago, the first two things you're going to do is select your subject and your grade range. But you'll notice there's no step 3 here to link a standard. So with a task, standards are linked to each activity or each question rather than the overarching task. So I'll go ahead and fill in my subject. I found a 7th grade science standard that I thought was a good example. And the first thing you'll want to do is enter in your task name and any instructions for the overall task. So students will sort of see that they're about to start a task when they're in their Schoolnet assessment. It'll give them the name of the task, the instructions for the task, and then it'll take them into each question for the task. So I'll go ahead and pop in a name. And for our example task, I'm actually going to set it up with pattern scoring. So I'll make sure my students know that with the instructions. They must get the first half correct to receive points for the second half. Below that, we have our scoring model that I'll go ahead and flip over to pattern scoring. And then below that, you have this add activity button. So this is where all the activities for this task will be listed. And when you add an activity, you can either search for one in an item bank, or you can create a new one using any of the standard item types. So I'm going to go ahead and grab a couple items from an item bank. And when you select that, it pops up sort of the standard item search interface. So I'm going to grab a standard and find a couple questions that go along with this. So let's see, I like that one, and this one's pretty good, and oh, why not? Let's grab a third one too. And just like when you're adding items to an assessment, it's going to show you at the bottom left how many you have selected, and with the ones you have selected, you can add them all to a task over here at the bottom right. So I'm going to go ahead and add those to my task. And so you'll see now that it lists activity A, B, and C. It tells me that they're all multiple choice questions or activities. The status is a green check, so that tells me there are no issues with those individual questions. There's nothing I need to double check before I try to use it. If any of these questions had passages linked, that would be listed here. It'll give you a points total, and finally the option to remove one of these from the task. You can add additional activities at this point, and if you want to edit one of these activities, you can click on the activity type here in the list, and that is going to take you into the activity detail screen. And if you have made tests in Schoolnet before, this area should look pretty familiar. So over here on the left, it's listing each activity that's associated with this task, and you can click through them to see the different ones. You can customize any of this if you want, if you have some reason to customize it. You see a typo, or you want to up the rigor or change the point values or something like that, add an explanation. You can make those edits here. Make sure to hit save at the bottom on each question if you do make any changes. And you can also add activities from here. And again, you can add them from the item bank or choose one of these various different types. So let's see. I know we had a request for a hotspot item, so let's just for fun add a hotspot to this particular question. So let's see. Maybe of the two. So we'll put that in there, and maybe we can find an image of some cells. I'll just pop out to a Google image search. And we can use the extra tools to find a Creative Commons licensed cell. Let's see. This will work just fine. So I'll grab that. Crop it down so the answers aren't there. All right. Now we can go back to our hotspot. So we've got our question content. The next thing with a hotspot will be to attach our canvas image. So I'll go grab that image we just found. Might be a little bit small, but hopefully it'll work for this example. All right, and now we'll create our hotspots. So in this case, we really only have 2 hotspots that we're going to identify. And we'll say that A is the correct answer. So I'm going to draw my hotspot for A. And let's switch this to the circle. So we'll just draw that circle over top of our animal cell here. That should be good enough. And then we'll draw a hotspot. Oops. Sorry. Now we'll draw a hotspot over our plant cell over here. There we go. So we've got our correct hotspot drawn, our incorrect hotspot. As always, we can add our tools, formula, reference sheets, additional properties down here. Or we can just go ahead and save that question. So, oops, it's complaining. I forgot to pick a standard for this question. So that is a great point. As you add, if you're adding questions to your task, make sure that you are also tagging standards to those questions. All right. Now we can save that, and we've got a nice green check. Once you're kind of done in this area, we can return to the edit task. You can either do that down here at the bottom next to the save button, or you also have that option here at the top right. So I'll go ahead and do that, and that is going to take me back out to the sort of task building screen. So now we've got all of our activities set up for our task. Down here it's going to summarize our standards alignment. Now all of our items are aligned to the same standard, but this area would list all the standards that have items up here, and you'll notice it says locked to activities. So the standards for this task are based on the standards linked to these activities. You can't otherwise edit these. And below that, you have the same additional properties that you get with pretty much everything you create in Schoolnet. You can put in your blooms level and that kind of thing. And as always, you can preview this. You can save to a personal bank. You can save to another bank. I'm going to go ahead and preview it just so you guys can kind of see what a task would look like for a student. Here we go. So we'll go ahead and start our test. So since this task has 4 activities, it's actually going to tell us it's a task. That's the name. And we've got our instructions here that our teacher typed in. If there were only 2 activities on this task, it would actually just show them the 2 questions here. But since there are 4, it's going to break it up. So we'll go ahead and do next. We've got our first question that we selected. We'll go ahead and pop an answer in there. Now remember, we selected pattern scoring. And I'm pretty sure this is the wrong answer. So we'll see what happens. We've got our second one. Let's see, I think it's that. Our third one, I'm pretty sure, is that. And finally, our fourth one, we've got this hotspot that we made. So these blue lines represent the areas we can pick. So if the two cells pictured, we have to pick the animal cell, and I'm pretty sure it's that one. And you can see that blue circle we drew earlier gets darker and more bold when a student clicks on it, so they know that that is the one they've selected as their answer. And we can go ahead and test our scoring out. And hey, we got 1 out of 1. So I guess I did get that first question right. If we're happy with that, we can X out. And I'm going to go ahead and save this to my personal bank as well. And this is a glitch I noticed earlier. If you've previewed the task, it automatically saves to your personal bank. And then when you're done previewing, it looks like the personal bank save button doesn't work. But I promise it is actually saved. If we go into our personal bank, we'll find that task saved. So another little, just small little thing to keep an eye out for. So I believe that pretty much covers it for tasks. Do we have any questions on tasks before I move on to rubrics? Which is another pretty fun topic, I think. So next up are rubrics, and rubrics in Schoolnet are pretty much exclusively for scoring open response items. So if, you use a lot of open response items, or maybe you have a standard rubric that you use to grade those open response items, building that rubric out in Schoolnet is going to make it easier to grade those open responses that are coming back in. When you go to grade the test, you're going to see the rubric right there, and you can very quickly click the student's performance level per your custom rubric. So I'll dive back into the training site. And yet again, we're under Assessments and the second Create link under Items, Rubrics, and Passages. And this time I'm going to create a rubric. And so the first thing it's going to ask you is to choose your grouping. And by default, grouping is going to be disabled. And so what that means is it gives you an example here. Grouping disabled is just a sort of basic, plain old rubric, right? You've got your levels along the top. You've got your skills or areas being assessed along the side. Descriptions in here, and a student is going to receive a score in each box. So they'll receive a 1 or 2 for clear thesis. They'll receive a 1 or 2 for presentation, right? We can also enable grouping, which is going to group these skills or areas being assessed. And when we do that, we can choose to either score each skill or score the group. So what do I mean by that? So with grouping enabled, now clear thesis and logical progression, the two things we're being scored on, are grouped under the content heading. But students will still receive scores for clear thesis and for logical progression. So I'm scoring each one of these boxes, right? I can also flip it to score entry by group. So doing it that way, I'm scoring students on content overall, a 1 or 2 on content, which is made up of a clear thesis and logical progression. So I feel like it sounds a little confusing, but you have a lot of options for how to organize your rubric. I'm going to keep it simple for mine and just leave grouping turned off. And once you hit choose to choose your grouping, you get dropped into the create rubric screen. And you can give it a name. And you'll select a subject. Now, when we're thinking about rubrics and open responses, my mind at least jumps straight to, okay, it's ELA, right? But think about other uses for this. Maybe you have some open response items on math assessments that ask students to explain their reasoning or explain their process for coming up with an answer. And maybe you want to build a rubric to grade those responses. I think that could be pretty cool. So we'll plug in a name, a subject, a grade level. You'll set your scale, whether you want to scale it based on levels or based on point values. So this is this level 1, 2, and 3, or are they scoring 1 point, 2 points, or 3 points? Up to you. You can set the rubric language here, and you do have a few additional optional fields. So if you wanted to organize your rubrics by keyword, or maybe you've got rights to use a rubric from a particular publisher, you could put that in here. And over here to the right, I'll point out you can change your grouping setting if you want at this point after you've started. But I'm just going to leave mine alone. Once you've entered in sort of this basic info, we'll go down and start building our rubric. So along the top, each column is the level. So level 1, level 2, level 3. You can add additional columns here if you wanted 4 levels or even more. You can take them back out with this little trash can icon. And then down along the left, you'll have the qualities or traits or skills that are being assessed. And you can, again, add additional rows here to add more qualities or skills. So we can start building this out. We'll start with the labels for each of our levels. These might be custom to your classroom or your subject area. Now, when we get into the quality, traits, or skills, each skill or quality or trait or thing being assessed has to be linked to a standard. So let's go find some standards to link. Sure, we'll just go for that. Maybe something like that. There we go. So we've built out our rubric levels. We've built out the skills or the things being assessed, and we've tied all of those to standards, right? Now, we will also need to enter in descriptions for these. So we'll just fill these in with some stuff. You would probably want to be a lot more descriptive with a real rubric, because your students would be able to see this, and this is what you would be looking at as you grade. So especially notes that would be helpful to your students or helpful to yourself as you grade this. You would want to plug in here, have some real specific criteria for each level. And once you've got your rubric all set up the way you like, you can go ahead and save that to a bank. And again, it'll pop up and ask you what bank you want to save it to. I'm just going to throw it in my personal bank like we have been. And now we've got a math writing rubric that we can use to score open response items. So how would we actually use this? Let's go take a look at that. So I'm just going to jump back out to the home page. We've got our rubric saved in our personal bank. We're good to go. So let's go create an open response item. So again, we're under assessments and the second create link. And we'll do an open response. So up here at the top, you'll, as usual, select a subject and a grade range. But for step 3, you'll notice there's an or here. So instead of selecting the standards alignment for this question, I'm going to go select a rubric. And this is going to pop up a search and show me all the rubrics I have access to. Here is the rubric we just made. So I'll go ahead and attach that. Now you'll notice most of my options here disappeared, right? It auto-filled that this is 5th grade math. It's using this rubric. If we scroll down to the standard alignment, we can see the standards that are tied to that rubric are now tied to this question. It tells me the standards are locked to the rubric. Now, one thing you can do is tweak the scoring. So if you're using this same rubric multiple times, but maybe this week I really want to assess my decimal operations more, maybe I weigh those heavier than the other 2 standards on the rubric. So that is an option. And you would just go ahead and fill in your question, save it, pull it into an assessment, and when you go to score that response, you will have the rubric available to input student scores. And that rubric will also, again, determine what standards are tied to the question and what standards you ultimately see on your assessment report. So before I roll on, do we have any questions about rubrics? So before I wrap up with you guys, I do want to share a few additional resources that I thought might be helpful. So as always, I did leave my buttons here for the Schoolnet training site and the Schoolnet Google site. The training site is always available for you to play with. And I try to keep the Google site up to date with all of the most relevant and latest information. The webinars and documents buttons are actually pages on the Google site. So the webinars page will alert you to upcoming webinars and other PD opportunities. It is also a place you can go to find recorded webinars. The documents page is a collection of all the different Schoolnet how-to documents I've been able to find here at DPI. So everything that Pam had put together before I started with Schoolnet and everything that I've been able to find since is all listed there. I also have listed their training presentations. So again, presentations Pam did 2 years ago are on there, and this presentation that I did tonight is on there already. So you are welcome to grab anything off of that documents page, use it, adapt it if you want to train others in your district, whatever you need, that is there for you. I also have linked the DPI Schoolnet videos. This will take you straight to the Schoolnet playlist on NCDPI's YouTube channel, and that is where we post all the Schoolnet videos that we create here at DPI. And then I have 3 quick reference documents to leave you with. There's the quick reference document on gap match items, kind of how that works, and all the things to consider with that. I've got one on using passages and creating passages and linking items to passages. This QRD covers all of those things, so if you need a refresher, that is there. And I've also got one on open response items and using rubrics, how to create rubrics, how to score with a rubric, all of that sort of stuff. So that document goes through all of that. I thank you yet again for joining me this evening. I know your time is valuable, and I greatly appreciate you choosing to spend it with me. And I hope that this has been helpful for you. And if we don't speak before the holidays, I hope you all have a very happy holiday and a wonderful new year.